Welcome. You're listening to Jay's Analysis, or watching Jay's Analysis. Today we cover Postmodern Imperialism, the Geopolitics of Great Games by Eric Walberg. And we're going to be giving a positive and a negative appraisal. There's going to be pros and cons. I'm going to be talking about where I think Walberg is correct and where I think that there are some mistakes in the book, particularly when it comes to paradigms and worldviews. Walberg, I think, you could class him as a bit of a leftist. He comes from a former Soviet perspective, and then now I think he says he's pro-Islam. So we're going to look at his take on postmodern geopolitics in the 20th century, much of which in the 20th century he gets correct. So there's going to be a lot that I agree with, but then when we come to what he calls imperialism, we're going to see that I think there's a little bit of confusion, because the idea here is that there is a neutral stance, that you can be neutral, that positions or beliefs or systems are not theory-laden. But I think that belief systems are theory-laden. There's no theory-neutral approach. And that being the case, it's very difficult to see how the Soviet kind of take that Walberg seems to have once lionized is not itself also guilty of a lot of the claims of imperialism that he's here seeking to oppose. So what we tend to see is that the geopolitical game doesn't really have good guys and bad guys in terms of the realpolitik. It's moralized, though, in terms of propaganda. There's always moralizing that goes on, and I'm not saying that that we can't apply morals to geopolitics, but it's really a question of whether there is a geopolitical altruism or not. So Walberg is, he says, a Rhodes Scholar and a former Soviet who changed his mind after 9/11. And he got to see through his travels, he says, a lot of different perspectives, particularly after 9/11. Walberg begins by discussing the geopolitical strategy of Halford Mackinder and Lord Curzon relating to Eurasia, and how the British Empire saw long ago that the key to controlling the world would be controlling Eurasia. This relates to the original Great Game, which he titles Great Game Number 1, GG Part 1. This will lead up to GG2, the Cold War, and then GG3, Great Game 3, which is where we are presently situated. He discusses the role of Brzezinski in the Second Cold War, or the Great Game 2, the role of the Silk Road, and how trade through the Silk Road was key, and that essentially the British Empire, once it had dealt with the Ottoman Empire, and once it realized it would only have to deal with Russia and Germany after World War I and World War II, it then was left alone in the world to basically set up its empire. Of course, the British Empire went bankrupt, and the U.S. Empire took its place. So NATO and its allies would become the force throughout the Cold War to essentially expand this imperial enterprise that he talks about. And really, the American Imperium is essentially the replacement for the old British Imperium. All that we've touched on and is correct. And we have essentially phases of imperialism that he talks about, where the empire essentially moves from expansion to parasitically eating on itself. And I think that when we are discussing especially the modern monopolistic financial capitalist imperium, that's exactly what we have. So these phases become parasitical, and he basically compares them to one another, late imperial phases, and how they essentially rely on a false patriotism, especially towards the latter phases of collapse and parasitical decay. So he discusses these phases that he sees as, for example, the financial houses of Great Game Part 1, mainly the Rothschilds, and this in our era would become the equivalent of what the IMF and the World Bank are. The playfield is the Middle East and Central Asia. in both cases, talking about the different phases of the Great Game. In the original Great Game, there was geopolitical rivalry. This has eventually been phased out in terms of power blocks for the present day era. And then we have the idea of communism as the threat that then the new threat in the present day Great Game being Islam and the war on terror. So the enemies change with the changing geopolitical situation. He also talks about the usage of migrants and mass movements of people as a key aspect of monopoly-controlled capitalistic imperialism. Another aspect of this, which he sees as crucial, is usury and the IMF and the giant world debt structure, which is a way to co-opt nations into basically following the paradigm of the central banks. He discusses the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, the Federal Reserve, and the network of central banks throughout the world. All of that he's nailed perfectly. It's all perfectly in line with Quigley. In fact, he quotes Quigley at length in both Treasury and Hope, and I think he quotes the Anglo-American establishment as well, which we've covered in toto at Jay's analysis, as you know. That's all well and good, and he's correct, especially when he discusses the power of capital in terms of the empire and its parasitical aspects, specifically in terms of usury. But one thing that's interesting when he compares imperiums and empires is that he seems to act or think that this was always the case. But in fact, Christendom, the reality of the empire for the first 1,000 years of the church, actually forbade usury. So usury is not a traditional Christian practice, but that's one of the key reasons why he sees empire as the problem. But he doesn't seem to touch on the fact or mention the fact that usury used to be forbidden until the papacy in the late Renaissance period began to argue for the validity of usury. That's actually not the fault of Jews, as it's often accused of being completely a Jewish plot. Actually, it was the Vatican that completely changed the West's perspective, particularly the Renaissance papacy, on usury. So he discusses the 7 rivals during the first period of the British Empire, the competing empires. This would be Russia, Germany, United States. Well, let's see, what are the 7 rivals? Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, Russia, Germany, and the U.S. and the UK. And between this period, you have this kind of shifting of powers. But we get the dominance of the British Empire and the Rhodes Roundtable groups, the Secret Society of the Elect that's mentioned, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, all of which I've covered in my Quigley talks. And the key aspect of the way that this empire runs is, of course, on drug trade and war and usury. So debt, drugs, war, it's really the key implements, the key aspects of the machinery of the modern, postmodern Imperium. And the U.S. essentially adopts this exact same model out of the British Imperium. It's no different. So the atomistic individual he critiques of liberalism, the liberal Imperium, which is what he's talking about here, based on, again, monetarism, debt, and he's going to go into very precise detail about how each one of these kind of interlocking scams works in terms of the Imperium. But again, the criticism I have is that the solutions of even something like as if Islam is not also a tool. Now, he does discuss aspects of Islam being used as a tool, but the point is that the ever since the Enlightenment, there's been the assumption that we can come up with a position that functions theory neutral, that doesn't try to impose its conclusions in terms of universals across the board. But every position necessitates universal truths. It doesn't matter what position you take. Even if you take the position that there's no position, that position still necessitates that everybody accept that there's no position, because it's dogmatically affirming that nothing is true. So this is where, again, foundational presuppositional questions come into play, even in the realm of geopolitics, because you're still extending your position to everyone else, even if your position is that there's no position. We've seen, again, time and time again, that relativism and the idea that there's no absolute truth actually just fosters another form of tyranny, where the people who have that position are then on a hell-bent mission to squash anyone else who believes in truth or disagrees with them. This is why there's no tolerance in the positions that claim to adhere to tolerance. So he's great at breaking down the imperial strategy, the dynamics of the totality of the phases of the postmodern Imperium, how it's moved from bad to worse, how the banks factor into this, all the different scams, the different black operations, how the IMF basically becomes the Bank for International Settlement model, why the gold standard factored into this and how it was useful. So in that regard, and how the Muslim Brotherhood was essentially utilized as a British imperial tool. And he, however, sets up this idea that communism was the foe of the empire. Now, in certain aspects, when he's talking about the Great Game played out at the level of the nation states and the power blocks, that's true. There were real wars and battles. But one of the flaws that I see here is that he doesn't see, even though he talks a lot about the CFR and all this stuff, and even Stalin not accepting the Marshall Plan aid, which suggests a degree of rebellion on the part of Stalin against the Western liberal Imperium. The problem is that he doesn't seem to be so far touching on the higher level funding of Marxism by the Western elite, especially what we get in Anthony Sutton or Reese Committee type stuff, where he does mention in one place the West funding communists for the Cold War, or against the Germans, and then tossing off that relationship afterwards. But there's again ambiguity about the role of the United Nations. The role of the United Nations in his book is conceived of as something positive in places, but in other places it's a completely controlled tool. So that may have to do with the fact that I think he has some role as a UN advisor and writer. So maybe he sees it as initially being something set up by the Atlanticist power bloc, and then he sees it as becoming good. I don't really buy into that. So I guess it's really a question of to what degree you see the geopolitical dynamic controlled, and whether you see communism as a real opposition, which I don't see it as that. So anyway, that's my initial analysis. He gets into some really good stuff about Sufis being used by the CIA, which not many people touch on, which I was made aware of a few years ago, reading Dreyfus's book, The Devil's Game. And he's touched on all those books that I've read and I've touched on over the years. So Mark Curtis's book, Robert Dreyfus's book, Devil's Game. But so that's my initial thoughts on the book, is that it seems to operate from the assumptions of neutrality, which doesn't work in science, doesn't work in philosophy, and it also doesn't work in geopolitics, right? Because every position is going to try to extend its position to other positions. And you could look at that as an analogy for the way he critiques Imperium. Empire seems to continually expand. Now, again, empire in the modern era is based on debt and usury, but it hasn't always been that way. So when he comes to critiquing the neoconservatives, when he comes to critiquing Reagan, Bush, all that kind of stuff, it's all spot on. So his analysis of the way the 20th century went down, I think, is correct. Like, he's got it all right, completely. All the black ops, he's nailed every single one of them. But he still is coming from this atheist perspective that I think is the weakness in the book, where he's not able to consider the possibility of transcendent influence. Instead, everything is conceived of as being a tool of the Imperium. So even Christian missionaries were just tools of the Imperium. But again, Christianity, for the first 1,300 years of the Imperium, forbade usury. Now, if Imperium is based on usury, then that doesn't make any sense. So I wouldn't say that this is why we can't locate all of Christianity under just some tool of of capitalist Imperium or traditional Imperium, like Marxism would tend to do. So that's what I see as the central flaw of the book. But anyway, definitely worth reading. I would recommend, with reservations. Again, the book's analysis of how a lot of things went down is true, but as to the solutions, I think we're missing some big pieces here. And he also seems to, like, he has, for example, he fits the drug trade very well into global geopolitics. So he's perfectly correct on that. Different mafia elements in the world, how they fit into being used by the CIA and so forth for drug trafficking. But again, the solutions from any atheistic perspective, I think, are going to be impossible. So thank you for listening. This is Jay Dyer. I'm on the road, by the way, so I'm not in my normal habitat, my normal cave, boomer cave. So thank you for your patience. I know we've been kind of behind, but I'll have some more content for subscribers to Jay's Analysis in the next couple days. It's just that I've been driving for extended periods of time, haven't had a chance to make any videos or audio. But I also wanted to finish Walberg's book. So thank you for listening, and definitely a book worth checking out for its analysis of what went down. But I have reservations in regards to all of his conclusions. Also, this week, Esoteric Hollywood 2 will be out and available. So get your copy. Signed copies from Jay's Analysis should be available in the next week or two. You'll see. I'll make it public. I'll do some videos on when you can get copies of Esoteric Hollywood 2. And I just talked to somebody who's read the manuscript already, and they think, and they're big fans of Part 1. They think Esoteric Hollywood 2 is better than Esoteric Hollywood 1. So I have to say thank you for that, and glad to hear that